right? You still, cars, they all have semiconductors in them everywhere. Fridges, semiconductors everywhere. There's these funny stories about how Russians were taking apart laundry machines because they had certain like Texas Instrument chips that they could then repurpose and put into like their anti-missile things, right? Like their S-400 or whatever. You would know more about this, but there's all sorts of like everything about semiconductors is so integral to every part of our lives.
So, can you explain the role of TSMC in the story of semiconductors and maybe also how the United States can break the reliance on TSMC?
I don't think it's necessarily breaking the reliance. I think it's getting TSMC to build in the U.S. But taking a step back, right? TSMC produces most of the world's chips, right? Especially on the foundry side. There's a lot of companies that build their own chips. Samsung, Intel, ST Micro, Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, all these kinds of companies build their own chips, NXP, but more and more of these companies are outsourcing to TSMC and have been for multiple decades.
Can you explain the supply chain there and where most of TSMC is in terms of manufacturing?
Sure. So historically, supply chain was companies would build their own chips. They would, it'd be a company started, they'd build their own chips, and then they'd design the chip and build the chip and sell it. Over time, this became really difficult because the cost of building a fab continues to compound every single generation. Of course, figuring out the technology for it is incredibly difficult regardless, but just the dollars and cents that are required, ignoring, saying, hey, yes, I have all the technical capability, which it's really hard to get that, by the way, right? Intel's failing, Samsung's failing, et cetera. But if you look at just the dollars to spend to build that next generation fab, it keeps growing, right? Sort of like, Moore's law is having the cost of chips every 2 years. There's a separate law that's sort of like doubling the cost of fabs every handful of years. And so you look at a leading edge fab that is going to be profitable today, that's building, 3 nanometer chips or 2 nanometer chips in the future. That's going to cost north of 30-40 billion dollars, right? And that's just for like a token amount. That's for that's like the base building block. And you probably need to build multiple, right? And so when you look at the industry over the last, if I go back 20, 30 years ago, there were 20, 30 companies that could build the most advanced chips, and then they would design them themselves and sell them, right? So companies like AMD would build their own chips. Intel, of course, still builds their own chips. They're very famous for it, but IBM would build their own chips. And, you could keep going down the list. All these companies built their own chips. Slowly, they kept falling like flies. And that's because of what TSMC did, right? They created the foundry business model, which is I'm not going to design any chips. I'm just going to contract manufacture chips for other people. And one of their early customers is NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA is the only semiconductor company that's worth, that's doing more than $1 billion of revenue that was started in the era of foundry, right? Every other company started before then and at some point had fabs, which is actually incredible, right? Like AMD and Intel and Broadcom
Such a
through the
great
history.
fact.
It's like everyone had fabs at some point, or some companies like Broadcom, it was like a merger, amalgamation of various companies that rolled up. But even today, Broadcom has fabs, right? They build iPhone RF radio chips sort of in Colorado for Apple, right? Like there all these companies had fabs, and for most of the fabs, they threw them away or sold them off, or they got rolled into something else. And now everyone relies on TSMC, right?